possible cheatgrass management. Rachel is the range specialist with the extension. So.
Thanks, Kelly. Hopefully you guys can all hear me. Brian mentions that I have a voice that carries, so hopefully you won't have too much trouble. Hopefully I won't be too loud. Like Kelly said, I'm going to talk a little bit about grazing and really focus on maintaining and keeping your perennial grasses healthy and vigorous. So grazing for cheatgrass management, it's fairly informal. If you guys have questions or comments, please feel free to interrupt as we go. So I, unlike Brian went to the trouble and did all this, fancy stuff with his grasses and stuff. I was lazy, and contrary to popular belief, this is not marijuana up here. This is actually good grasses. That's an illustration of a good grass species. So just keep that in mind for this short illustration and this cheatgrass. I think often we find this system is a pretty often found system. We have our good grasses intermixed within our cheatgrass. And as Brian mentioned with the control methods, we come in and we alleviate those cheatgrass with a herbicide of some sort, but we're still left with the same amount of nutrients and available resources, right? So as managers, we can come in and we can either increase those good grasses or we can decrease it with our management strategies. We obviously want to increase our grasses so they grow well, and with rain and correct temperatures, that always helps, right? The poor people in Texas would probably disagree with me on this right now, but you increase the good stand of grasses and maybe even promote a few grasses to grow root systems to produce more good grasses through their rhizomatous root systems in our perennial systems. So this is probably a good scenario to outcompete or to tip that balance a little bit. Really, our systems are all about balance, right? It's like anything else in life. We're trying to balance and put that competitive advantage towards the desirable species and leave it less towards that cheatgrass or those undesirable weeds. So if we keep maintaining our same strategies as grazing managers, we may decrease that desirable population, right? Again, we have the same amount of nutrients available in that system, maybe even a little bit more, and cheatgrass has an excellent opportunity to come in, right? So we need to think about this in a very systematic way. How are we in our decisions impacting, and this can be both in our herbicide decisions and, as I will focus more on, in our grazing management decisions. Who all in here has some sort of livestock, whether that be goats, cattle, horses, sheep? So quite a few people in this room. So I'm definitely preaching to the choir, and hopefully we can go through and give you some tools to put in your toolbox as a livestock manager. Now when we talk about grazing, we can think of this as a type of disturbance, right? Like any other disturbance such as fire, this can have bad, good, or neutral impacts on our rangeland or pasture systems. So this might be, some, and sorry in the back, hopefully you can see those pictures, but that might be what we would commonly see in good, bad, and neutral type scenarios. As land managers, we can look at our systems and say, okay, do I have a heavy load of grasses? Do I have a heavy shrub component? And we can select our species that will be complementary to that system, right? And that helps us utilize or better utilize our systems. But we want to match our animals to that resource. And in, I guess, technical terms, this is sort of what we call targeted grazing. Targeted grazing isn't just about utilizing animals to decrease weeds, although that is a common assumption or what people think. Targeted grazing really is just the application of a specific kind of livestock at a determined season, duration, and intensity to accomplish our goals or objectives as land managers. So to begin this talk, we're going to focus and kind of look a little bit deeper at what our goals might be. How many of you have set goals for your operations or your acreages? where you sat down with everyone and said, here's our goals. So that's a really great place to start, but something that people overlook often, right? We think, well, we're just going to go out there and control cheatgrass, or we're going to go out there and do something else. But taking a step back and really determining our goals is going to help us in the long term and visualize if we're reaching those or if we're not, and how we use different strategies to accomplish these goals. So developing goals and objectives is important for us as land managers. You want to keep them simple, attainable, and especially measurable is what I would personally think. You want to have something that you're striving for, and how do you know if you're getting there if you can't measure it, right? So something as easy as I want to decrease my amount of bare ground, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the field, doing cover data and how to gather that, and it's a really pretty simple process. We might want to improve sage grouse or reduce the amount of cheatgrass, increase the amount of perennial grasses. So keeping your goals in mind and keeping them simple, attainable, and especially measurable is awfully important. So once we have our goals set in our overall plan, we want to understand, we're going to start with understanding how plants grow. And this is going to help us determine the impacts of our grazing and develop a grazing strategy to meet our goals. So we're going to focus on the really detailed look of how plants grow, and especially how grasses grow. This is a cheatgrass workshop, so we're going to focus on the grasses. So a very basic idea is, how do we tell the difference between an annual and perennial grass? How do we know those differences, and how do they respond? Anyone in the audience?
Types of roots. An annual grass will have like a carrot type root.
Right, very wimpy, like Brian talked about in his talk. You know, if you reach down and pull that, we can pull cheatgrass out pretty easy, right? It's a kind of a wimpy plant on its own. If you try to get down there and pull a perennial grass, you're not going to get much of the root system. So knowing what type of plant you're dealing with and how it reproduces. Annual plants put all of their energy, like May talked about in her talk, cheatgrass puts all of its energy into seed growth, right? Into producing those seeds. So knowing that, in our minds, we can think, okay, we want to decrease that, so we want to alleviate that. We want to stop that process. They don't have much of a root system, so we don't have to worry about that. Leafy spurge, on the other hand, has a tremendous root system, so we're going to have to deal with those differently. So knowing, you know, what it is, an annual or a perennial plant, is not only going to help you control it, but also help you promote, I guess, in those good perennial grasses. How do I promote that root growth so it can reproduce both by seed but mostly by roots? So let's take a grass, for example. Grass species to me are kind of neat because they're unique compared to forbs and shrubs. Why they're unique is, well, let's just take for example, they put up little tillers, and each tiller has a stem, has leaves, and a root system. Now what causes a grass plant to go from a vegetative tiller to a reproductive tiller? It can be their hormones, it can be the environment, it can be our management scheme that gets that plant from the vegetative state to the reproductive state. One thing interesting about grasses is where their apical meristem, that's just a fancy word to make me look smart, also known as the growing point. The growing point is located at the base of the grass. So if I have a situation where I go out and I cut down that grass or I mow that grass, what happens in the long term? What happens in our yard situations? Do you kill that plant by mowing it? No, it grows back, right? And that's the great thing about grasses. They have a system where you can actually graze them and decrease the amount of biomass. And if you don't hurt that growing point, they don't have to start all over and gather nutrients from their roots to put up another tiller. So knowledge of where that growing point is particularly important to us as land managers and grass growers, right? But what unfortunately happens in grasses is the growing point elevates as it goes from that vegetative state to the reproductive state. So when it has continued moisture, the right temperatures, and it moves into that reproductive state, that growing point elevates. So what do you think happens? It might be more vulnerable at this state, right? Me as a rancher or a livestock owner, I need to be careful or mindful where that growing point is and how I'm going to damage that perennial plant. So it's a little more vulnerable as it moves into the boot stage and the reproductive stage, and we'll go into a little more detail about that. So this is just the stages as an overall. You can look at that. I'm sorry, I'm standing right in front of you guys. Overall, the growing point being at the base of those grasses, the perennial grass picture in the upper left. The lower right is a forb species. Tell me where a growing point on a forb plant might be, and what happens when you eliminate that. What happens when we cut our forb? Say a leafy spurge plant gets cut. Just keeps growing, right? It shoots off and keeps growing. Whereas a grass species is a little bit different. It's got one growing point at the lower end, and it elevates as it becomes in the reproductive phase. So we're fairly safe down here, and then it elevates as time goes on. The root systems are also something that's important to look at, not just the above biomass, but the below ground biomass. I like this illustration because it really shows what's going on in our root systems. This is a healthy root system. You have your perennial grasses have tons of roots. Their fibrous root systems are intermingling, and it provides a canopy, so you have a really good situation there. Now, each year, perennial species lose 30% of their root systems. So we have to promote that root growth by leaving a little bit of that biomass or that stubble height so photosynthesis can take place and regenerate that root system, regenerate that 30% that's lost. What happens if we have the same amount of nutrients, the same space like we looked at in our illustration? What happens once those root systems become weakened because we continually take off that growing point? So they have to continue to bring nutrients from their root systems. You're weakening that root system, right? So this is kind of a cheatgrass on steroids, I guess. That was, again, clip art, and I'm not as creative as Brian. So this provides a great opportunity for them to come in and utilize those resources and that moisture in the soil and nutrients. So time after time, if we don't promote our root systems, we're not going to get healthy, and we're going to see a lot more cheatgrass come in and invade those areas. So now that we've talked a little bit about the grass growth and focused on that, how about specifying when grazing should be applied to reach our management goals? When the plants are less susceptible to damage by grazing, and when we want to promote or utilize grazing to decrease our target weed, so making it when it's most susceptible to damage, when they're palatable to livestock. Cheatgrass really is fairly palatable, right? In the springtime, it can be used as a fairly good resource. So when we can attack that without hitting our other grasses is kind of our goal. So this was a good illustration by Launchbaugh and Olson, and it basically goes through and looks at the plant growth phase and what's going on. We all know and can tell our animals, they love that springtime grass, right? It's the most nutritious, it's the most palatable, but it decreases as time goes on, right? Your grasses become less palatable to animals as time goes. Our susceptibility is obviously highest here. When do you think this is? Right before that seed set. What's going on that we talked about in the basic grass growth phase? What might be going on there, making it most susceptible to grazing? Anybody? The growing point is elevated. Right. So that might be a most susceptible time, so you might want to be mindful of that. You know that your perennial grasses are susceptible at that moment. So when you graze, obviously, the effects of grazing differ with when you graze, what stage those plants are in. Early growth, rapid growth, reproductive, and dormancy. Is it the same time year after year? On May 1st, are your plants doing the same thing year after year after year? No, this year was really different, right? June was wet, things were really slow, plants weren't growing. So you're getting different systems. So paying attention to your plants as a manager is probably a pretty smart idea annually, not just every other year. So what's going on in the early growth phase? This is when that plant is in its vegetative state, carbohydrates from the roots for the first few leaves, They're pulling that nutrients out of its root systems to put up those first few tillers. Then you have a limited amount of green material, but it's really palatable, right? So your animals want to be out there impacting that. You want to be mindful of your intensity. You know the old saying that as fast as your grass is growing, you want to be moving that fast. So the grass is, growing a little bit faster, but there's not a lot out there. So keep your animals spread out or moving fast. Soil moisture may be available, so we don't have to worry about that. But temperatures may be just getting high enough to where the plants are really starting to grow. Then you go into the rapid growth phase where you really start to see, sometimes we can even literally watch grass grow, right? That maybe a week or two at a time, and you go out there and you really see things come on. The period can be relatively short, maybe about a week, so you want to be mindful of this, again, as a livestock manager. Grasses are also storing carbohydrates. They're using their first leaves to conduct photosynthesis and put carbohydrates and nutrients back into those root systems when the 30% is lost and you're depleting that root system by putting up new tillers. Again, this is the reproductive period, so the boot stage is kind of the most damaging because your growing point is elevated. Moderate intensity should ensure some ungrazed plants, so you want to kind of get in there and get out and not be here at the same time year after year after year, right? Because you are impacting that, and if you do that year after year, you're really depleting that root system. Dormancy is a pretty safe time to be grazing, right? The plants have done their thing for the year. They're putting carbohydrates back into the soil. You want to consider trampling of your crowns and maybe animal performance because they're not as nutrient or palatable, nutritious at that point. But you want to still maintain maybe some of that stubble height. And so dormancy grazing is pretty safe, but still want to be mindful of those particular things. So maybe as a manager, I can change the timing or the season of use, right? That might benefit my desirable plants. Plan grazing at a time to optimize the negative impacts on undesirable weeds. So you might want to be grazing, early grazing of cheatgrass. So here's kind of a little illustration of what that might look like. All put together, the plant is utilizing those root systems to put up the first few leaves. Rain comes, things are rapidly growing, sets its seed, puts things back into the ground, replenishes that 30%. Old Bessie comes by and she clips that off. That was a pretty sustainable situation, right? She grazed during the dormancy period, so it was a pretty okay scenario. One thing we have to remember as land managers is that the target plant is always embedded within numerous other plants. We'll see that in the field today, like Brian talked about. You've got a matrix of desirable plants, and the goal is, again, it's a balancing act. Me as a manager, I've got to shift that competitive balance to favor my good grasses and not favor the bad ones. So how can we shift that and play around with our system to make that happen? So how many of you just have the same grasses in all your pastures? Monocultures, everybody kind of have the same? No, right? We have tons of different grasses. We have cool season grasses that come on early and then sort of die out as we start to get warmer. We've got warm season grasses that come on a little bit later. So we need to be mindful if we're using grazing to not only target our undesirables, but sustain our desirables. It's kind of a complex thing, right? We need to have a plan, set our goals, know what's out there, and then manage accordingly. It's kind of like putting a puzzle together, right? You've got to know the different components so you can make the most sustainable choices as land managers. So controlling the frequency intensity is something in our power, right? We as land managers can't control the weather or what goes on with our environment, but we can control the frequency and the intensity. So how many times we graze that pasture or those plants and our utilization levels. We want to promote, again, the desirables and decrease the undesirables. You have to look across your landscapes. You can't just look in one pasture. You've got to take a landscape approach when you're developing your grazing strategy. So here's sort of two, I think I have two examples in here. Here's an allotment where they kind of changed up their frequency intensity. This is an allotment on the left, and then West Elk is on the right. In 1991, they had 3 pastures, with each pasture being grazed 10 days at a time. What do you notice about this pasture that's grazed often?
There's some more bare ground.
Right, you've got some bare ground, maybe some weedy species in there. So with the 3 pasture rotation, not terrible, but could be a lot better. So they went ahead in 1999, they did 45 days post-grazing on this side, and then this was ungrazed. And this is really an interesting photo because they look a lot different, right? Those plants probably aren't much different on both sides of that fence. But what do you see in this picture that you don't see in here by grazing occurring early in the springtime? New growth, right, because as we talked about, in the situation where you have your lawn, it never sets seed and turns brown, right? As long as you have that moisture and the temperatures, you get regrowth, and it remains green. So that's kind of what's going on here. It's sort of stimulated some of that growth, which grazing or mowing can do if sustainable. And if you're not taking off that growing point time after time after time, you're going to get an increase in that. And then these guys just set seed and went through their process a little bit sooner. So here they modified this using an 8 pasture rotation, grazing 2 to 11 days, no reduction in AUMs. We're seeing a lot of differences, right? We're seeing that come in and fill in. So like Brian talked about in his talk, decreasing the weeds, promoting that open area, you've got some bare ground, fill that in with your good grasses by providing them a chance to grow or regrow in that system. So that's what we can control as managers. Here was another situation where they shortened the duration. They did a pasture, cut the pastures up a little bit. You've got some thistle, just kind of not a real sustainable looking system. They even increased their AUMs by 25%. This one was in 2001. I'm sorry, I did those in black. And 98, I think that says. So you're seeing a big difference. Willows coming in, you decrease your weeds. A system is pretty forgiving if you give those plants a chance to grow and regrow. Here was an interesting study done in 2008 at Oregon State in the eastern side of Oregon. They clipped plots, and they clipped their plots at 1 inch, clipped the plants at 1 inch and at 3 inches. They clipped them during the boot stage and then at the purple stage. And then they clipped them once during the growing season and twice during the growing season. What type of scenario or all of these options, what option do you think produced the highest reduction in cheatgrass seed? Whoever can tell me that. Purple. Gets a shirt?
Boot stage.
Boot stage.
Boot stage?
Yeah.
1 inch.
1 inch? Wait, raise your hand, I'm sorry, raise your hand, 1 sec. Okay, raise your hand. Who said 1 inch? Willow? What's your guess?
1 inch boot stage and twice.
1 inch boot stage and twice. Why would that decrease? That's right. Why do you think that would decrease that cheatgrass seed production?
Because you're getting rid of your growing point and you're not going to have the opportunity to regrow.
Right, so you're taking that knowledge of, okay, what do I know about a grass and the specifics of grass growth, and how can I apply that to decrease this bad grass, right? So I'm flipping the tables on what would be bad for a desirable species but would be good for an undesirable. And you can have either a shirt, book, come see me after this talk. So good, yeah, that's exactly the combination that was the death of the cheatgrass seed. So the treatment resulted in, and this is getting back to what May talked about in her talk a little bit, seed densities between 123 and 324 seeds per meter square. At one site, 769 and 2,256 seeds, which seems like a lot still until you look at the unclipped plots, where you're getting 13,000, 20,000 seeds. So that's a major decrease, right? So not only did we, simulate intensive utilization, we were able to reduce the production up to 90 to 99% over 1 year. So is this something we may want to do? Is this a good idea, you think, that we might do this year after year after year, that we might go in knowing what we know, all that we covered in this talk? Is this a good idea? You would go in there knowing that you maybe had other perennial grasses and maybe hit it year after year after year? I don't know as if I would, because what might happen to our perennial species if we hit it at the boot stage year after year after year? We might decrease those roots, right? So thinking about, we have to take a real systems approach, right? We can't just look at, wow, this is really good for cheatgrass. That's, like Brian said, why we're not hunting and have $1 million, because there's no silver bullet, right? You've got to look at your system, know what's there, know what good grasses you have, know when their growing season is. It turns really complex really fast. You want to do something, maybe you can do this 1 year, maybe you can intensively graze, maybe you can spray 1 year, you get an decrease of cheatgrass, and you come in and you graze responsibly and you try to promote the growth. There's numerous options. It's just putting those puzzle pieces together. And as land managers, I think you have the responsibility to know your place, know your animals, know your situation, so you can make informed decisions like this on a yearly basis. And not to mention the environment is just a huge variable in and of itself. So really complex, but knowing some of these things can be tools for us to make those decisions. So good idea maybe on a year, but maybe not on a 20-year doing that same thing year after year. So what would you say, is there a way to manage grazing to increase the benefit of doing weed management in the first place? I think so. I think we can do things to increase that benefit by either starting with, like Brian said, maybe you'll have to reseed, but reseeding in a way that's responsible, grazing that area in a responsible way, so when we do come in and spray and alleviate some plants from that system, our good grasses will go ahead and take up those areas of empty space and nutrients that are available once you remove cheatgrass or whatever weed out of the system. So I think there is a way to do that. So just to kind of wrap up, a successful grazing strategy for weed control should cause significant damage to the target plant if possible, whether that be with a herbicide or maybe coming in early, intensively grazing. You've got to stock pretty heavy, and that's usually not a real sustainable answer, but can be utilized. You can utilize cheatgrass. So you want to damage the target plant without damaging our surrounding vegetation. So non-target impacts, we want to pay attention to that. And be integrated with other control methods as a part of a larger management scheme. So we may come in and spray, but we have to be mindful, okay, what am I going to do with my animals now that I've sprayed and I've released some of those nutrients? So here's some recommendations. Managing grazing to obviously promote your perennial grass plant development and respond to that competitive release from invasive species if you come in and spray. A conservative approach, some people say don't graze for 2 growing seasons. However, from this we can take that maybe we, after 1 year, can graze the dormant season. That's a pretty safe time. We might be able to come in and graze that, but maybe keep that in mind and be mindful if we do a spray, we don't want to damage those good grasses, so maybe a dormancy grazing would be a good option for us. Sustainable grazing practices over long term can actually reduce the impacts of weed invasion, and mismanaged grazing contributed to weed invasions. Herbicide treatment will not solve that problem alone. I think we can all say it's pretty exciting to go out there and spray that cheatgrass and see it go out of the system, but if we don't come back within that 3-year, I think that 3-year range is a good time to come back in and see what's going on, and we may have to make adjustments. And being mindful of that as we go through and as we graze our livestock is important. So thank you for your attention. Are there any questions or comments? Grant.
2 periods of the year when cheatgrass is the most palatable. Looks like we're talking mostly about spring grazing or early summer. Is there any chance that fall grazing could have some kind of impact?
You know, I think, and this I think is something that people talk about. I think if you really want to have or desire to have an impact with grazing on cheatgrass, I think you have to stock that thing so heavy and intensively. I don't know if it's really practical in the grand scheme of things. If I'm a rancher, I'm not so sure that I will want to, or I can purchase the amount of cattle that are needed to really decrease that cheatgrass, because I can't sustain that herd throughout the year. So I think when we talk about controlling cheatgrass with grazing, I just don't think it's a viable option by itself. That being said, I think anytime you have that emergence of cheatgrass, heck, you can use it. You know, use it to your advantage, and maybe come in there one year on one pasture and you know, developing your grand scheme. I think whenever you get that first germination, it's very palatable and very useful. But I think to think that we're going to control it using grazing, I just think that's a pretty high hope. I think we wouldn't see the amount of cheatgrass in the Great Basin if that was the case. If grazing was a viable option, I think they would have, you wouldn't see near that amount of cheatgrass. So does that kind of answer your question?
Rachel, I have another possible comment on that as well. When cheatgrass comes up in the fall, it doesn't typically get to the food stage and the reproductive stage, does it? It kind of overwinters as a seedling and comes up the next year. So maybe you wouldn't do the damage that you would want to that plant at that time.
Right, you're right, and that's a good point. Sometimes it can. Cheatgrass has the potential of germinating both in the spring and in the fall, and so you know, at times you will hit the boot stage and actually go to the seed. But a lot of times, if we don't have that moisture and temperature for that particular plant, so yeah, depending on the year, you could use that as a viable option. And that's probably what you were saying, Grant, in that.
Yeah, I guess another thing is, it seems like, especially with an annual plant like that, that a lot of those would actually be pulled out as they're being grazed. I don't know if that's, anybody's checked that or not.
I think with horses especially, tend to pull a little bit more. I think, you know, cattle, you won't necessarily see that near as much. But yeah, that I don't know. Has anyone looked at that? I've never really seen that in the literature or anything. So, have you seen any studies like that? But that would be like you said, their root system is so weak that it might be decreasing it at least. Anybody else?
When are the seeds viable in the springtime? When they turn purple, are they viable at that point?
I think it kind of goes through a dough stage, right. And so I think once it kind of goes out of that dough and the green and kind of hardens a little bit, so, and I think it depends on year to year obviously, but once they kind of drop their seeds, that's when I'm assuming that it's viable, is when it drops that seed. So if you can catch it before it drops that, but that can be anywhere from, I don't know, does that take about a week or something for it to turn viable? Once that seed becomes viable, would be.
To germinate?
Mm-hmm. Jay was asking when that seed.
If you mowed it, mechanically mowed it.
Right.
At what point would you have to hit it before those seeds are viable, so that you don't just drop the plant on the ground and the seed's still viable?
Like I said, in the.
When it's at that soft dough stage, if not before.
And so, how do you tell that though?
No, it's going to potentially be viable.
Jay was wondering, can you tell by a color? And I don't think you can. I think it's a matter of, you know, a week to a few days where that actually happens, that turns viable. And so you'd have to be pretty, I don't know if you could visually catch that.
I would say if it's already purple, it's already viable.
Okay.
That would be my guess. Now, it doesn't mean it's ready to germinate. It has to after ripen for a time to be ready to germinate, so it's viable and dormant. Generally. And then
right.
It has to sit around for a month or two to be ready to germinate.
But I think Jay was asking if you were to mow it, right, to catch it before it actually dropped its seed. So I guess if you could catch it before it's purple, I suppose you'd be pretty safe. Is that what you would assume? Good question, though. Anybody else? Okay.